Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. It's been a while. We're now in season 2 of Progressive Profiles, and I decided to start it off with a bang with Tristan, who you may have seen in a variety of different projects and involved in a variety of different things. But since he's here, why don't we let him tell us what he's been up to? So, Tristan, tell us who you are, what you do on the internet.
Sure. My name is Tristan. Tristan Johnson. I guess I should go the full name.
Okay,
And
I didn't want to, maybe dox you or anything.
No. I have a name that has like there's 6 or 7 other Tristan Johnsons who are also of reasonable popularity. Like I think there's an MMA fighter and I'm trying to remember there's another one. There's a bunch of athletes in like high school football and stuff like that across. It's a common name. Anyways, my main projects these days are raising a baby full time. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm working on videos for Step Back, the shirt I'm wearing right now, which is a website or a YouTube channel where I talk about history, specifically about the importance of understanding the past in understanding the importance. Okay, maybe I should rephrase that as the importance of the past in relation to understanding things as they're going on today. I've sort of been typecast in the last year or so as a researcher of the American far right, mostly because my expertise is in US. I have master's degrees in American history and American cultural studies, so it fits. The other project I do is much more fun, which is It's Probably Not Aliens, which is a podcast where me and my co-host Scott Nicewander from NerdSync do a show where we basically investigate and analyze and debunk stuff from the realms of pseudohistory and pseudoarchaeology, usually with a focus on UFO stuff. And right now we're sort of mostly focused on Ancient Aliens, the History Channel show. And while we do the debunking, we also try to dedicate a lot of it to teaching you about the actual history that they are sort of glossing over with the alien stuff. I think that's the main things that I'm into right now. I have like a little list of things that's for, because like my son's going to daycare in like spring next year. So I'm like, for March, these are the things that I can entertain doing. But for now, I'm mostly just holding on the fort with those 2 projects.
No, well, those are very good projects. Step Back, especially, not that many of my viewers will know this or listeners here, but I have been following that for a long time. Back in the day when you had like just a little animation, it's like, what is Sikhism? And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I like this channel. I'm gonna give it a subscribe.
Oh,
and
gosh.
Yeah. And then now it's like, hey folks, let's go down the depressing rabbit hole that is how the far right came to be. And I'm like, oh, this is fun. We're having a good time.
Yeah.
But as for the podcast, It's Probably Not Aliens. That is so cathartic because I enjoy watching the show Ancient Aliens, but like purely as a kind of junk food for my brain, not to kind of take any of it very seriously. And some of the stuff that they try and say or connect, I'm like, that just doesn't make sense for incredibly simple and easily observed reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good THC watch. So I definitely with you there. I mean, I have to watch the show now. So
you're obligated. You're contractually obligated to watch Giorgio Tsoukalis.
Yeah, and you're kind of like picking up that my channel's changed quite a bit over the years because the channel is going to be 7 next month.
Wow.
I just got an announcement today on my dashboard that 7 years ago is when I made the Step Back like channel. I didn't make my first video until September, but this is when I first started it when I was like, just thinking of like graphics and branding and all that kind of stuff. But YouTube's changed quite a bit. Like when I first started, the animated 5-minute explainer video was king. Everybody wanted to be CGP Grey, and the format changed. I sort of watched the world change in ways that realized that I needed to be involved in conversations that I thought was, sort of outside of my scope. But I don't know. Things evolve over the years, and now I do the sad history, I guess. or more common these days is that, as I kind of mentioned, I did a very successful series are still doing. I have one more left in the chamber for it. A series on the white power movement in the United States, sort of
Yeah.
in the wake of the Vietnam War. And that video series did just such huge numbers that it has basically come to define my channel, since a good chunk of my audience now know me just through that. So it's a worthwhile beat. I'm good. I'm glad to be, I think, what you watch when you run out of Robert Evans content. I think that's a good way to describe it.
I mean, no, look, you can gloat a little bit. It's good stuff with good historical analysis. As someone who also enjoys history, even though I'm very much an amateur when it comes to it, it has been good to see more people kind of do the kind of history that I was very fortunate to get in both middle school and high school, where the teachers actually cared. So it wasn't just a timeline of events that we were then quizzed on. It was actual, hey, so why do you think this might have been the case? Or what were factors that might have led to this? How does this affect your understanding or preconceptions of, say, our nation's history, and how the French are involved, and how that also involves with colonialism and indigenous people? I'm like, damn, this Lebanese teacher is really pulling out all the stops to actually make us think about history. Like, kudos to this guy. So, that for me, it has always been important, but there's a lot of people out there who either don't pay attention or they don't have proper teachers. So what is something that you think could be done, whether in the YouTube sphere or in the education sphere, that could make history more palatable and accessible to people?
I think the main thing, because like I've taught history at the university level. I've actually like done guest lectures and been a TA in university classes on US history. And obviously I did a master's degree in history, and I did basically like most of a PhD in history at a certain point. I dropped out because I stepped back, but that's a different story. But essentially, I think that the main thing is that there's a lot of people who say they don't like history, mostly because it's either boring or they don't feel it's important. And then when something huge happens, like Russia invades a country or something like that, everyone is just like, how could this have happened? I don't understand. This is nuts. Like, and like some of the things like, Iran, evil country. We don't know why they're like this way. Why do they act like this? They just hate us for reasons that we don't comprehend. And it's like,
so actually,
I think that a lot of, yeah, well, that's the thing, is like a lot of our understanding of the world today lacks dimension if you don't understand the context and history behind it. But we don't teach history in quite that fashion, mostly because if you say anything close, mostly because if you talk about the past in ways that are academic, you will get accused of being a Marxist, critical race theory, whatever, and you could get your career jeopardized in some districts. But yeah, essentially, like there's, I guess there's two ways to look at it. So like one, if there was a good way to make history more popular and more relevant, it would be to focus on things that are relevant. Don't like tell the long drawn out history of your country because, in chronological order, because that's not the way that we will be able to apply these things to our lives. But talking about the way things are and how they came, where they came from, I think is important. And I kind of started step back to do that. But the other reason is because there's a big gap between mainstream history education and history as an academic discipline. There was this thing that I read that was, I think it was like the high school history curriculum for Quebec students.
Okay.
Where like they laid out that the goals of the curriculum are to create patriotic citizens and good consumers. And I don't know if that was maybe a bad translation or something like that, but there is, yeah, for exactly. Hostie, Callis. But yeah, the idea is, I did my undergrad in Quebec.
Okay.
The main thing is that history, as it's taught in a lot of public school education systems, is more designed to create patriotic citizens rather than teach how history actually is. And as somebody who taught taught at the university level, you have to like, as soon as you get your first year students, you have to almost like deprogram them from this like nationalist education that the government wants to put forward to make you just like, love your country.
Yeah,
And
and
then go
especially in
into
their
like,
case, to love Quebec. So it's like, hey, can we maybe get that referendum again? I do want to talk a bit more about your YouTube channel because you said it's now been 7 years. It's changed a whole lot, going from kind of, hey, here's some things you maybe didn't know about, to let's get into the real nitty gritty. When this was happening, were you also, say, like delving further into being for lack of a better term, a left-wing radical, and so you want to put more of that content out there as well? Or did you decide, oh, you know what, I am already a very like left-wing person, and now I want to put more of that into my content? Like how did that change kind of happen? Because if you look at a recent video versus an earlier video, it is very different in terms of the political content, as it were.
yeah. Well, I guess I could say that it definitely wasn't me that changed necessarily, because I think I got radicalized but through the like invasion of Iraq in like 2003. I do remember somewhere between the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. That's when it happened. And I was like, a wee lad at that point. I think I was like high school, well, basically. I remember
Same.
joining like the Justice. I think it was like a club called the Justice Mongers. We were trying to oppose the invasion of Iraq from our suburban Canadian high school. Um, Good times. But as
Yeah, you had the fighting spirit. I respect it.
Yeah, and like I know that anarcho-communism is now all in vogue, but it was a thing that I was interested in and identified with as early as like 2009, when there was like two of them on the internet at that point. Um, so so yeah, like I've been into radical politics for a very, very, very long time. And it was, I mean, there was some of it in the step back work, very, very buried deep, but it just wasn't the thing that I was going to be doing. Like I was kind of very much like, step back is some fun educational creative project when I first started, basically, with a sort of eye towards, because I started it basically the September that I started my PhD.
Oh,
And
okay.
the idea was that I was very interested in history communication and I wanted to work on this. And I thought that, hey, maybe someday I will be able to, not only if this is successful, it'd be a really great side gig to do with my research, but that at some point I could like use it as a selling point for like the really competitive field of trying to get the very few history faculty jobs at universities and such. But I can almost pinpoint the moment when things started changing, because I think it's when everything broke necessarily, and it was a video I made on the Colfax massacre, which was a sort of post Civil War act of terrorism. Basically, it was a democratic coup against the elected Republican government in Louisiana. Basically, it was like a white supremacist mob that took out the like last vestiges of this like brief experiment in multiracial democracy that happened like right after the Civil War. And I talked about it because I was like, hey, there's this guy running for president who's really fucking scary. We should all be kind of concerned about this.
Yeah.
And I think I said it in the video that I was like, this is like the closest I've seen like the rhetoric of like the Klan and stuff really making it to the mainstream. Um, and then as that kind of just kept happening over time, I kept like seeing like the sort of world falling apart around me. And I was like, oh, it's too. I basically was like, I had a platform. These were issues that I was very concerned about. And I felt like like every time I was making a video, I felt like less and less like I can like avoid having these conversations without every time I make a video, like anytime I try to make a video on something that's like light and fluffy, I feel like I'm wasting my time when there's so many important things that we need to be talking about like right now. And so that just kept happening. And to be honest, I think that brought out more of the sort of feelings I had deep down, which like a lot of the passion sort of came out because I was not only doing history, I was doing a lot of this activist stuff. And those two meshed in a way that really worked. And I think that came through in the videos. And I think that came through to the viewers of the channel. And the channel got very successful by my not. I always have this habit because when you're in the content creation business, you're supposed to be very personable with the cameras, very share a lot of yourself with them. And my instinct is to do the exact opposite of that. I'm an extremely private person. I don't like talking about myself. I don't like going into. I don't like promoting myself. Like probably one of the reasons why I kind of started around the same time as like H Bomber Guy and ContraPoints. I even remember when ContraPoints was like a little channel that was smaller than Step Back, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. Oh. I can't wait to. I actually was a patron for a little bit of like baby ContraPoints, and I was like, so I came up in that cohort of YouTubers, but they were much better at selling themselves than me, and I guess they were funnier and more charismatic. So things shut off, and I think that I tried to get in on that game as well. I just think I got into it late or something. I don't know. I speculating on how I did that or whatever is sometimes is a fruitless endeavor. But I just started getting more into sharing myself with the content, and the more comfortable I get doing that, the better the channel does. And I'm still not there. I'm still very bad at expressing myself in my videos, but I find that the more I do it, the more successful it is. But I feel like I just walked into a completely different subject. But basically, I started talking about things that I cared about because I saw a lot of things that were very concerning that I thought people needed to know about. And the more I did that, the more the channel did well. And so I just kind of kept doing it. And now it's all I do.
Yeah, well, you also have the podcast. It's Probably Not Aliens. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I had in like my do someday list for years. Actually, I was one time thinking about getting Mildred from Thought Slime on board to do the podcast. A few years ago, I was talking to him about doing it, and it was basically
real quick. Would it have been anything like that video you two did where it's like, I am Fleep Florp from Planet Bleep Lorp?
We never even delved out that far, but that video sort of got the ball rolling on the idea that I was like, this could be like, there was so much that I did not get to put in that video. But I just bounced back like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did a podcast on this? And then he was like, yeah, that would be cool. And then that was it. The conversation just got dropped. Because he's an incredibly busy person, as you can guess. And so was I, because I was still in grad school at that point, I think. No, I was post-grad school, but I just, was grinding out content, which is a lot of time. Anyways, it just sat on my shelf along with a couple other projects that are still sitting on the shelf. But then Scott was trying to branch out. He had success with like a D&D podcast that he was part of the cast of, and he wanted to get more into podcasting. And so he was like apparently he was looking for a podcast to do with his girlfriend. And he put a post out on Twitter being like, hey, what are some podcast ideas that you would like for me to do? And people put a bunch of suggestions, but one of them was essentially the idea I had, which was to just respond to Ancient Aliens. And someone replied to that. And then I replied to that with like, oh, I've literally been thinking about doing this for ages. And we just kind of started talking to each other behind the scenes. And then we made this podcast, and it's been like the most immediate success I've ever had with a show. I have lots of friends in real life who, and this is not a thing that I hold against them. They do not watch Step Back. They do not care about the videos. They know that I'm a YouTuber. They think that's kind of neat, but, and that works at parties I end up having really interesting conversations about my work at parties. But if you actually know me day to day, they get over it very fast. And then it's just like, yeah, Tristan's a YouTuber, and Mark's sells insurance, and Nicole works at a pet store, et cetera, et cetera. And so like, they don't care. I have had way more people come out of the woodwork, people who I haven't talked to in years, who are like, this podcast is really good, guys. And what it is, it's just a response to Ancient Aliens, and with G Education, like the thing I pitched earlier. And we're like 40 some episodes into this point, and I think I mentioned, I think we're still on like episode 5 of Ancient Aliens, like season 1. So we have so much more to go.
A lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, and like, I learned a lot about myself through that project, because I think I work a lot better with a second person. Like me on my own, like there's a very unique talent of people who can talk by themselves to a camera and sound like they are talking to another person. Scott has that in spades. That's why he's a fanatically successful YouTuber. But I always struggle with that. It's a thing I'm actively trying to develop. I'm actually thinking, once I have a bit more time, of taking like acting lessons and improv lessons to sort of get a bit of it. But I feed off very well, bouncing off of other people. And Scott is extremely quick, and he's very entertaining. And he also takes care of the entire tech side. Like basically, when we do the show, it's almost like a baton pass. Like, I do all of the work before, and then we record the show. And then after the show, it goes out of my hands and it goes into his. And I don't see it again until it comes out. So.
Oh wow!
But it's got a good energy. It's funny. I feel like both Scott and I get to feed off of our strengths, off of each other, and it's resulted in a really fun project that people seem to be really into, or people really are digging.
Yeah, I remember when you first announced it. Like, I think I was there, like, sharing it on multiple platforms. Like, yo, get hype! I love this. I love these content creators. I like love the subject in terms of dunking on it. Like, yes, absolutely, inject this shit into my veins. So yeah, can confirm it's great stuff. And on a little side note, like, history and like working with other people, and how it's kind of like, oh, okay, it's all new to me. I have been a part of a podcast that I don't really promote, because it's just so different from like my current YouTube stuff that I'm doing. It'd be kind of like, trying to tell someone who's into, say, British tea parties, hey, you should go to the roller derby now. Like, it's just very different. But that's been very good to like work with other people and get an experience for like what podcasting is like. And there's a part of me that would love to do a history, like a proper history podcast of some kind. But then a friend of the channel, Scott, otherwise known as Pinko Punko, he has a YouTube channel, and he also recently started a podcast called Haphazard History. And he had me on as a guest, and we talked about Igor Guzenko and like all the crazy kind of like spy shenanigans and human rights abuses that happened in the wake of that. And like, I think it was 1949 when that went down. So, I mean, it was fascinating. I learned a lot. I knew a bunch of stuff and even contributed. And so there was that good kind of back and forth going on, and it was a whole lot of fun. Like, I have to do a bit of my own bothered boy ranting on this show, at least a little bit, because I just can't help myself. I have a problem. I need to go to Ranters Anonymous or something. So, like, Ancient Aliens, right? Let's actually talk about this a little bit. Like, I know you have the show, but like, my God, some of the stuff that they suggest, right? And it's very often they've gotten a bit better about it recently, as far as I can tell, but it seems very much like, oh, if we don't have a historical record of it, then it must be aliens, rather than like people for millennia have been looking around and observing things and experimenting. It's why we have like Neolithic versions of Stonehenge in the middle of the Sahara Desert, because back then it was grassland, and even back then humans were looking at the sky and recognizing it moved, and they saw certain planets and stars and constellations. They recognized they could tie some of these to the seasons. It wasn't, oh, aliens in the Sahara. It's like, no, man, I want to know when to plant the grain or when I need to move my cattle, okay? Like, that's what it was. Like, it's just, please tell me you feel the same way of just like, people, this is just like absurd.
I mean, it is absurd in some ways, like, because like you follow the people who do this, and it's very much like I'm finding it more. It's like a case of extremely motivated reasoning. You know, it's people who really, really, really want aliens to be, like, well, for extraterrestrial intelligences to really like have visited us, and they really want that to be a thing that happened. And so they are sort of going a priori into the subject, looking for the aliens, not like, looking at things at a sort of objective stance, or at least trying to, rule out or maybe look at some of the more plausible explanations. And when you're talking about something as mind shattering as extraterrestrial intelligence, there's a lot of very not plausible things that are more plausible than that. And
yeah.
But the thing is, and what I'm learning is that in their motivated reasoning and their search to find any connections they can, they often do a lot of sloppy archaeology because they're outsiders who mosey into a subject they don't know anything about, and then make connections based on their modern understanding of things, and don't do the work of really understanding the subject or the context or the culture that they're in, and then making aliens come in, and in turn, in a lot of cases, especially like I've shown in the show, like it's a lot of people's only education about that subject. Like I noticed this when they were doing an episode, or they did a bit on the Dogon people, which is sort of a nation of people who live in Mali, and like that's like the only thing a lot of people know about them is like they saw the star and it's the alien thing. And I was like, okay,
yeah, and it's the star that you can actually see. So how did they know about it?
Mm-hmm. But like that. And so like, that's why like I wanted to do the show, because it's like, oh, not only do I not want to debunk the Dogon people thing, but I want to tell you who the Dogon people are and what kind of things there are about them. But on the note of like the sort of contextual understanding and stuff like that, like so much of Ancient Aliens, there's an episode that's going to be coming out. It was supposed to come out today. I think it got delayed because Scott is traveling and his internet's not super great right now. But about Renaissance art and how these things that look like UFOs to like a modern viewer are not understanding because they don't understand the art history behind all these symbols. Understand, like if you look at them in the context of other things, like, oh, it's angels. It's almost always angels, but like,
what if angels are aliens?
Yeah, well, that's another level, but they'll like take a text that is oftentimes translated from another language, a dead language. Like if you're like dealing with translations of translations that they are not proficient in, so they don't have commentary on the different words and definitions and all that kind of thing. Then doing that, they then make connections based on their half understanding of words, then make modern interpretations in at the same time while they are actively looking for the aliens, and they fit things in all these different ways, and it just results in nonsense because they're just doing bad archaeology or bad research to fill a preconceived conclusion. I can like summarize most of the episodes of the podcast down to that.
Yeah, but I mean, like it is worth analyzing, because some of the stuff that they're saying is just so ludicrous. And to add context to that, right? I remember seeing an episode once, and I had remembered this one in particular because it stood out to me, because I remember we actually covered this in a bit of art history in like our grade 11 art class or something like that. You know, they were trying to show several instances of Renaissance art with like saints or like Mother Mary. And there's this, beam that's entering her forehead. She's receiving knowledge from the visitors on high. And I'm like, okay, so we legit talked about this in art history, and it's a kind of visual metaphor for receiving the inspiration of Christ, or the inspiration for the divine. It's a very spiritual thing. It's meant to be like, purity and God's essence, or like, the message of God. It's like put into your mind, like, and that's also why they have the halos. Were their heads actually glowing? Probably not. It's about the symbolism. But here they are, like, yeah, well, like, maybe it was like, beamed into her head by the aliens. God's actually an alien. I'm like, people, this is really reaching here when we also just have the history and the context for why this is a thing. And then more recently, I remember, the whole mystery of like, how did they get some of these seemingly like, folded stones going into like Inca and various other South American architecture? How could they possibly have done this and like, lifted them into place? What could possibly have happened? What's not ever talked about is that when the Spanish conquistadors were first asking people, hey, how did you do this? They said, well, we kind of took these plants, we made a concoction, and it kind of melted the stone. And they're like, oh, silly savages, that's impossible. Anyway, recently people decided to actually give a go of it, and oh, look at that. It basically kind of softens the stone into a kind of moldable concrete. That's how they got the stones to be that way and fit so perfectly, and how some of them seemed folded in some cases to, fit into like certain keystones and whatnot, because they basically made a kind of chemical that reacted with the stone to make it more malleable. Wow, engineering. No, it had to be aliens that formed stone rather than use like, I don't know, whatever crazy like as yet to be discovered elements that the aliens would have likely been using, right? Like it's just so absurd in that regard, and also insulting. Do you find it insulting, or maybe that's just my like inner Latino feeling insulted, that it's like, just because you don't know what my ancestors did doesn't mean that it was aliens,
Yeah. There's a lot of, because it also like stems off a bunch of interesting curiosity, because there are things that we don't exactly know how they were made. And that is an interesting question. But, the alien of the gaps does diminish looking into what could actually be the reason behind that. And I think a good case that has been more recently solved that sort of fits that is one of the number one targets of ancient alien theories are the Moai on the island of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. And one of the things is that the indigenous people on there would say that the Moai walked to their resting place. And they were like, oh, well, that must mean that like they were like beamed over or something like that. Because like, how could these things can't walk? That's bananas. But then they did some more like, archaeology and some experimental archaeology, which sounds like possibly the most fun job that I can imagine.
Yeah,
where they did walk the Moai statues, which is sort of like, have you ever tried to move a refrigerator or like a really heavy dresser? You have to like shuffle it one thing at a time. And they just did that with like ropes and coordinated pulling of them. And I was like, oh, like, yeah, like, doom, doom. Yeah. Okay. I get it. That I could see that as being, you're walking it over. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the part of the beauty and nuance of language, and yeah, I remember seeing that video, I think on Tumblr a couple years back, where it showed them, there were like 3 teams, 2 on each side, kind of pulling it at like angles, kind of pulling it forward and back and forth, and then just a third team on the back making sure it didn't tip too far forward or anything like that. So they're just like holding tension, and like, sure, it takes time, but it's like, yeah, no, with a team of people, you can make this work. And another one I think they recently solved with the pyramids of Egypt, because they were like, how do they get these blocks up there, and with sand and stuff, and they didn't have certain advanced metals and stuff, you couldn't cut these stones. And I remember a couple of people were experimenting with different things, and there was one dude who realized, hey, wait a second, they had plenty of copper and like bronze and stuff, right? So what if we just made a simple kind of bronze like saw without any teeth, but then we just put a bunch of sand and just use that as the grit force and to cut through? And they're like, wow, this is actually remarkably effective. And then others, there was this like depiction with people pulling the sleds of the stones up as they were assembling the pyramids, but there was someone pouring water in front of the sled, and the initial assumption was, oh, that must have been some kind of ritual. And then people said, well, hey, wait a second, if you add water to sand, that changes its properties and its friction. So let's do that. And then they said, oh, this is actually much easier to pull, the sleds and the stones. And oh, guess what Egypt has plenty of? Water and sand. So yeah, that's how they did it, right? Like, they were very ingenious in using what they had. And I think that for me is the ultimate, like, really deeply insulting thing about Ancient Aliens, is it removes all kind of creativity and perseverance and intelligence and ingenuity in a variety of different ecosystems and cultures of humanity. It's like, no, humans can't do this stuff. No, that's impossible, as opposed to humans being like, can we eat this? Can we build this? Can we go there? How do we get there based on what we have available? It's like the Inuit built, the igloos as shelters, and they were using what they had around them. People building rafts out of reeds, assembling pyramids using like stone and water and sand, which is what they had. Like, there is so much human ingenuity, and Ancient Aliens just kind of shits on all of that. We're like, no, can't be us. It's got to be aliens. We're not possible to do this. It's I find it insulting. I think that for me is the core problem that I have with all these people.
Mm-hmm. It also relies a lot on some two very deep misunderstandings of people of the past that I think are important to mention, which is the first one being that there's this idea that technology is this very linear force that you progress in a direction like it's civilization or something like that, and that different civilizations have, like, that technology in the past must have been simple or unsophisticated, or something like that. Like what a really good example is that's done of indigenous Americans when they interacted first with Europeans. There's a lot of idea like, oh, they were very simple because they didn't have firearms, they didn't have log cabins or monocrop agriculture. But that is sort of not understanding that technology doesn't work linearly. They had a very sophisticated form of agriculture that required much less work and was much more sustainable. They did a lot of geoengineering projects using slash and burn technology to move herds of animals and to cultivate forests to grow the things they need. Like a really good example is that the Amazon is being discovered to have, as like they're chopping down the Amazon to make pasture land for cows, they're discovering a whole lot of ruins to show that there was probably a time when a lot of the Amazon was cut down, or at least was much more managed than it is now, because there was like a huge civilization living in the Amazon. And then it was like, oh, is it possible the reason why there's so many fruit trees and food trees in the Amazon is because this civilization basically was like cultivating this massive rainforest to serve their needs? That's very interesting. That's very much a hypothesis. I can't, like, it's something that's very much like, that's interesting because this civilization, there's very little known about it because a lot of it is just buried deep in the Amazon. But the other assumption is that people of the past, because their technology was less sophisticated, I guess, they had harnessed less energy at that point. That even though, most technology did not move that much before industrialization, and we don't really appreciate that very much either. But that the people of those past were somehow, less than, or, were not as intelligent when, humans of 10,000 years ago were just as smart as we are today. They were just as clever, just as capable of solving problems in interesting ways that we are. They did not have the same, generations built upon generations of innovations to pass on to each other, but they still were very clever. And there's actually a very interesting recent study that's trying to studying how humans have been evolving in the last few thousand years. And the main thing they came up with is our brains are shrinking. Not because we're getting dumber. That's not exactly how that works. But we are turning into a civilization. Like, people 10,000 years ago had to have a lot more stuff memorized, landscape plants, animals, different things like that, that they had to rely a lot more on their memories, and we are relying less and less on it over time. So it just shows that like they lived very different lives, but they were not they were able to do clever things. They were just as there were people just as smart as NASA engineers 10,000 years ago. They might not have had the education in mathematics and all that kind of stuff to do the things they were, but they people that smart did exist.
Yeah, like again, they were building, 20, 30,000 years ago, large Neolithic sites, versions of Stonehenge throughout Africa and what we now call the Middle East. Like all this stuff is out there. And so I do kind of like to imagine that in the past, it was just a lot of angry cave people being very frustrated that they didn't have the technology. It's like they could see how something could work, but the tools they had available just weren't right or strong enough or fine enough. It's like the stone just ain't right. It needs to be stronger than a stone. What's stronger than a stone? I don't know. Like, that's kind of the vibe that I get, where they were like, we know that there's like something we could do. We just don't have access to yet. And we're still experimenting. We're still, doing stuff. And again, back then people liked music. Like we've found like bone flutes that are way older than any pre-recorded history. Like it's an ancient thing. We liked hearing music. We liked, seeing the stars and understanding them. Like the story of humanity is a long and difficult one, but there's a lot of beauty to it. And like, are those the 2 points, or did you have a second point to
that is
okay.
Those are the 2 points.
No, well, I think those are two very good points. And speaking of like some more points and whatnot, earlier on you had mentioned, and I wanted to come back to this for a while, that you were an AnCom before it was cool. So
in a way,
like how did you become an AnCom? Because like, to just briefly summarize things for me is, I was radicalized at a fairly early age because Mike Harris wanted to cut funding for French schools, which I was in. So, mom having to kind of gently explain to 10-year-old me, well, some people don't think that, they should pay to have you learn French, even if it's part of your heritage, etc. So I was like, oh, so people will just oppose stuff that directly impacts me purely because they don't like it, and like that's it, no real justification. Like, okay, interesting. First moment of radicalization. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. I faced a lot of racism and discrimination for appearing Muslim. I'm not, but back then I was like darker and looked more Arab, and that caught me a lot of shit unnecessarily. So another point of radicalization. And then of course the crash in 2008, and government's not doing anything really substantial in response to that. It's like, okay, all right, I gave people, the benefit of the doubt for a while, but like I went from, basically a small L liberal to like, I guess I'm a social democrat, to now like, like communism or bust at this point, basically. So yeah, how did you get to AnCom?
Well, I think like at my home, my parents are pretty, I wouldn't say that they were like left wing, but they were like sort of more progressive liberals. They're the kind of people who would vote NDP if it was like socially acceptable to, basically. Like
That's what separates your parents from mine. They vote NDP.
Yeah, I think they do now, basically.
Actually, I don't know. My dad does switch, actually. So yeah, no, I shouldn't say that he votes NDP. I'm actually really not sure.
My folks live in Burlington, where the NDP don't have a snowball's chance in hell. So I don't particularly fault them for their vote. But either way, there's basically like I've always like, I wasn't raised in like a particularly conservative household. My parents, I was not raised with those kind of things. And when I was very young, they did like the sort of like school election-y type stuff where every time there was an election, they do like a mock version of it in the school, and they gave us the platforms to think about and all those kinds of things. And I was like, oh, NDP, right? Because then every one of those things, the NDP gets like commanding majorities.
Yeah. It's like, well, then kids go out and vote.
But then I think the main thing that kind of put me down the real rabbit hole is the war on terror. 9/11 happened when I was, I want to say almost 13 years old. but so I was like in eighth grade. And I remember that being a really big deal. And I mean, 9/11 was the subject of my academic research. So you can imagine
Oh,
it takes up a
fun.
lot of my brain space. But watching everything, like, my safe childhood of, peace and serenity fall apart. I didn't realize that, Canada in the 1990s was going through like a lot of political turmoil that I was not privy to because I was a kid. The only time I remember is vaguely being very nervous on Halloween of 1995 because my French family was all in Canada and they were like, "Oh shit, like this referendum's going to be wild."
Yeah.
But either way, that didn't really affect me, I don't think. But the transparency of how weak the case for Iraq was really got to me. And I remember that drove me up the wall. And I had a teacher who passed me on a book called Rogue Nation. It's like an introduction to the America the rest of the world knows. And it's basically like a good list of like America's major and minor war crimes in the 20th century. Like how Hiroshima wasn't exactly necessary, and a bunch of other things, and that really kind of got me going. I would still say that was like in the social democratic realm for that period. What I think got me more radical, the main thing was the 2008 crash and the end of the Bush years, because like when I was a teenager, everything was rallied around, war on terror is bad, Bush bad. That's the thing, right? Like if we get John Kerry, and I remember caring about John Kerry winning the election. Um, this is like the most 2004 thing. I remember the night of the election going to Toronto to see Green Day playing because they were on the American Idiot tour. And they were saying on stage, like, "We hope we're going to go home tonight and see that John Kerry's won the election." And I was like, yeah, because I'm 15. I don't know shit. Um, and then went home and, saw that Bush had won.
Yeah.
But either way, like I kind of like how I imagine that there's a lot of teenagers today who saw their political awakening all focused around sort of the energy to undo Trump's presidency. Basically, he became like the locus of like everything that's wrong with America and the world. When Bush got out of office and Obama got elected, and the financial crash that happened resulted in nothing major changing, and that the Democrats kind of continued to pursue all these things that never went anywhere.
And
Right at
also
around
just
the
like
time,
kept doing the Bush stuff. It's like,
yeah, that is when I definitely had a major falling out with like sort of mainstream progressive politics, and I started getting a little bit more radicalized. I thought I was, like a democratic socialist or something like that. But it was also when YouTube started becoming a thing. And there wasn't a lot of anarcho communists on YouTube in like 2006, 2007. There was a lot of this is the thing. There was a whole lot of ANCAPs on YouTube in 2006, 2007,
ugh.
including, I even remember because I sent an email and I think I can even, because I
Or
still have the
are we
same.
about to get like some exclusive behind the scenes content?
So Tristan, in 2009, so that would have April of 2009. So this is when I was 20, I guess. Um, I sent an email to s.molyneux@rogers.com, the email address of Stefan Molyneux, because I was watching these like anarchists on YouTube. But I was like, I'm kind of like, here, I'll read the email that I sent. "Hello, Mr. Molyneux. My name is Tristan. I'm a budding anarchist myself, and I have a couple questions about DROs and how they're different and they could function." DROs is sort of like the ANCAP answer to court systems, basically. They're dispute resolution organizations. "Would they necessarily need to all be profit companies? Could, say, a communist DRO function as, say, a union or a nonprofit organization or NGO or any other sort of structure aside from a company?" So I sent that to Stefan Molyneux in 2009.
Wow.
So just shows that like this is I had this weird moment because what happened was that I was into this concept of like, can we organize society without a state? But I did not know at all about Kropotkin, Conquest of Bread, did not know anything about the sort of long history of left-wing anarchist organization. All I knew was AnCom dipshits on YouTube. Um, and so I was like, I'm going to make something really novel. I'm going to put together an ideology of left-wing anarchism, and it's going to be a huge deal. And then I very quickly just found out that the Conquest of Bread existed. And I sort of just went from there. But
oh, some dude beat me to the punch by like well over 100 years.
yeah. So but luckily that did not last long. Because like, yeah, I was like 19, and 19-year-old men think that they know everything and know absolutely nothing. So I that happened to me. That was my like sort of political awakening, was dipshit ANCAPs made me an anarcho-communist somehow.
That's
and then
good,
I sort
ultimately.
yeah. And then I put it on ice because I then went to undergrad, and I went to undergrad in rural Quebec, where I did not have very much internet. Like my dorm room internet gave me 1 gigabyte a week.
How far
So
we've come.
I did not do a lot of interneting. I was too busy being cool and going to class and hanging out with friends and stuff like that. And I became like, just didn't care that much about politics when I was there for a little while. I mean, I got into like social justice causes and stuff like that. Like I think I was in a bunch of, and this is biography. I was like in the Pride. I was the only straight member of the Pride Alliance and the only male member of the Feminist Club and stuff like that.
Nice.
Which was that was super fun. But then kind of when I came back to go to grad school and I moved over back to Ontario, to London, that was right when Gamergate was just starting to take off.
Oh no.
So I came back and I was like, oh, like what happened to all of those atheist YouTubers that I frequented in 2008 when I was a young lad? And then I was like, oh no. Oh,
yeah. Turns
what
out
happened with what happened in an elevator? What happened with this elevator? What's going on? And yeah, obviously I had changed a whole lot in that time too. So very different, but I sort of got more into things as I kind of returned to civilization, in a way, or I returned to at least, cultural context that I could actually see the world in. But yeah, I always said that I was an anarcho-communist, and I gave people copies of the Conquest of Bread in undergrad, but I just didn't think about it all that much. That was just who I am. But I got really, really much more into it as I started, developing philosophically when I entered grad school, when you have to read like a hell of a lot of books and think a lot about things very deeply. And that sort of, I developed it a lot from there. And then I think it was stirred on by the Trump presidency and the Bernie campaign. A lot more people became socialists. And in that, even the small minority that became anarchists was just a huge amount compared to what it was before. And so all of a sudden I knew a whole lot of people who were anarchists. And I guess I'm now like, oh gosh, I'm now like the oldest anarchist on the internet or something. like in like 2010 or 11, I like revered Noam Chomsky, and I'm like, oh no, now I thought Noam Chomsky was the only anarchist alive or something like that. And now I'm like, oh, now there are dozens of us out there. And to me, that's like, and that's like a multi-1,000% increase from when I first started. So I'll take it. And yeah, I love it. It's really cool because like it was very lonely in 2009, I will say.
I can imagine. Good Lord.
Yeah.
Like,
and
it's funny that you bring that up about Noam Chomsky and stuff, because I also remember, being a much more, I guess you could say, militant atheist back in like high school days. So, oh, look, I'm following a lot of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and even Sam Harris for a while. But then I was like, hey, wait a second. No, some of their takes are kind of really terrible and just like baseless. Wait a second. And so like, I just quietly stopped, celebrating their every move after a while when I was like 15 or 16. But, yeah, like if you don't look back on your teenage years and don't have at least a little bit of cringe, are you really living life correctly? I mean,
Yeah, I got into all the same thing, and I think a lot of people who are radical leftists today also were in that sort of soup in like the 2008 2009 period. I followed all those same people. I read I think the three I read like what's it called, the Three Horsemen books at a certain time. Um, and one of the things that I think was a very big driving force that I've hopefully channeled into a lot of good, which was that their ideas drove me in a direction that was extremely Islamophobic. And that was a really gross part of my past. Um, and then when I went to undergrad, I met a very kind and extraordinarily patient Moroccan woman who uh, refused to put up with my bullshit and talk to me a lot more. And then I ended up writing my master's thesis on post 9/11 Islamophobia. And I don't know if this shows up in my work a whole lot, but Islamophobia is like probably the biggest case that the biggest social justice cause that I like get really agitated about, especially because I grew up in the GTA, and I grew up with a lot of like Muslim kids in school, and to watch like sort of society turn against them and even myself turn against them um is terrifying. And so I think also that experience, that like sort of, obviously, like if I hadn't gone off to university and disappeared into the woods of Quebec for a few years, I would have gone in some dark places.
Well,
Because I
then
was all
thank God for the woods of Quebec.
because I was like, 2008, 2009, like I was in this weird place where I actually graduated high school with like a D minus average. Um, and then I tried to become, it's so silly. I tried to become a record producer, and I tried to get into audio engineering stuff. And I
Okay.
took the entire like RESP that my family had put aside and blew it all on this audio engineering school, and then failed out and had no education money, and had no had just like a high school education. And it was like 2008, or like the end of 2007 and 2008, where it's like everything is economically falling
Yeah,
apart.
it's collapsing. Oof.
Yeah, and if I had not
Ooh.
been yeah, if I had not gone into a program that was designed for people who had bad high school marks but wanted to go to university, which I think was Sheridan was hosting at the time, and gone off to Quebec, I think like that soup and that media diet that I was on, I could have gone in a very, very bad direction.
It's kind of like, that was the alt-right pipeline before it was fully articulated or fully formed. This
Mm-hmm.
soupy morass, or this abyss that people don't even realize kind of sticks its tendrils out and pulls you in, and then you don't realize you're in a very dark, bad place. So I'm glad you got out of it. I'm also glad I got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And before I forget, because like you mentioned about books and reading, and I tried looking for it in this bookshelf, but I don't see it. In any case, it's a history book by a Canadian author called, I think, Margaret Macmillan, and it's called The Uses and Abuses of History. Um, Pretty
I've read that one.
easy.
Yeah,
Oh,
I believe I read that one when I was in grad school at some point. But
yeah. I
um,
mean, for me, it was a pretty quick and easy read. I read it in like one evening. Like, it's not really that hard to get through. And spoilers, folks, the core of the story, or not the story, but the message you're meant to take away is a bit more understanding of how countries and nations use history to their advantage, and why they don't like certain aspects of their history because it goes against what they want to teach or inspire in people. But history is also, and how we teach it, is a reflection of how we view and see ourselves. And so with this in mind, right, it makes a lot of sense now, thinking about how a lot of Canadians view themselves, because the history is very limited, and it's just kind of just the rosy good bullet points. Like, it's always just on the up and up with Canada. Sure, we have a few stumbles here and there, but we always come out the other side, and we're just doing so well. Isn't it so great to be Canadian? And then it's like, so how come we don't talk at all about our literal 200-year history of slavery? Like that's a part of our history. That's, you know, to use the Historic of Canada, a part of our heritage, but it's not really mentioned. And with America, you know, how they teach history is like, you know, the shining city on a hill destined by God to lead the world, you know, like it's some really messed up stuff. You see it with Britain as well. Like, you know, we're clearly better than everyone else. And it's like, it's fascinating to kind of have that additional context of how to look at how countries use history or how they're afraid of certain parts of their history and what that says about countries and the governments and, you know, what they want the history curriculum to be, and to show that, like, you know, history is good and valid, but it also can be used basically as propaganda, as we see in, you know, Canada, Britain, and the United States. So, and hell, you even touched on that earlier in the show with, you know, the Quebec high school curriculum. Like, we want to produce good little patriots and consumers. Like, that's so messed up, but that's what they want people to come away with. So, with this in mind, and with, you know, all the leftism that we've talked about, what kind of would give you hope, or maybe even what's kind of the roadmap out of this morass of darkness that we're in with regards to misinformation, historic inaccuracy, and propaganda? What do you think is something that we collectively, as like leftist progressives, etc., can do to kind of fight back against all this?
I feel like if I had an answer, a good answer, I would be advocating it very hard right now. There's kind of a couple ways to look at it. There's like the broad historical view, because my PhD stuff was about the history of technology and communication. So there's a little bit of this in here. Because like you think about like the 19th century, right? And like they had a culture where newspapers did not have any sort of expectation that they had to print the truth. That, you know, when you read the newspaper, there was sort of like a reader beware mindset that anything could be said, and you had to sort of be more discerning to figure out what was real and what was just sort of shit they made up. That was sort of the norm in the 19th century, and they sort of, you know, mocked people who couldn't figure it out, who got tricked. And then you have this sort of internet age where you have a sort of similar situation where propaganda, fake stuff is sort of becoming the norm. And so there's two ways to look at it. You can either think that it is the case of a new technology, like the fact that the internet is still, like, by a lot of technology and communication history standards, still a very young form of technology that has yet to establish the norms and standards that would lead to quality information. And that, you know, we was going in that direction. Like, we were at a point where everybody had a GeoCities page where they could post anything they wanted. There was a time where all the social media platforms were full of people spouting hate that has been, you know, largely, I wouldn't say it's been managed, but there's definitely been a lot of work trying to address that, to a future where who knows where things will go. You know, there's ways that it's good in the fact that, like, you know, maybe there'll be more work to counter hate speech and stuff, but it might be bad in the fact that it will, kind of like what happened with a lot of other media platforms, shrink to smaller and smaller, but larger and more established streams. You know, people already complain that, like, YouTube is turning into a platform for, like, Seth Meyers and John Oliver clips, and not so much for, like, small indie content creators, because they're kind of a liability from a corporate standpoint.
Yeah, gotta get that sweet money, right? It's capitalism, baby.
Yeah. So there's that thought that it is just sort of the aspect of a young technology. And in that case, then the future will be about seizing the means of production, of media production, because when you know, social media congeals into sort of a form as it matures more as a communications medium, the people who have the power to make those policy decisions are the ones who are going to be deciding it. So, you know, it's just simple. Just revolutionize the entire economy to make it democratic and socialist. Because, right, yeah, because
easy. We'll do it tomorrow.
super, yeah. The other way to look at it, and this one actually might be this might be interesting, and that is that it could be that the 20th we are sort of stuck in a mentality that is sort of outdated because we grew up in the 20th century, and a lot of the people who are in power grew up in the 20th century, and that it's possible that the 20th century was, for various factors, a unique period where media was especially controlled by authorities, and that all the time before it there was no real control, and all the time after it there was no real control. And the 20th century is just this period where, because of the confluence of media, that just like sort of how it was. Like maybe we will never go back to a Walter Cronkite tells you how it is type situation, and then we might go to the future where we'll have to think more like the people who read newspapers in the 19th century, where we will just be expected to be more literate and be more skeptical of things, which in some ways is good. Like I think that a lot of the ways that the same forces that are creating like, you know, waves of hate speech and horrible ideas to resurrect themselves from near death are the same ones that are letting us have conversations about things that would never have been talked about 30 years ago. Like, I think the same forces that are, putting, like, radicalizing people into the far right are also the same liberations of communication media that has us talking about representation in media in a lot stronger ways, that let us talk about things like the Me Too movement and stuff like that, that would not have been mainstream conversations if, you know, 3 corporations decided what we were going to talk about. But now that people who normally did not have voices in the past can force us to have that conversation, it leads to a lot of new things for good and ill. So there's sort of a Pandora's box thing there. And I think that if we make meaningful things to address the sort of hate speech and radicalization funnels that are happening, I also have concerns that we may also end up clamping down on all of the very interesting new conversations and new ideas that we are establishing. And I hope that we can find a solution that doesn't take one out, or, you know, can take one out without the other. One that gets the Nazis off Twitter, but also allows for trans people to talk about their experiences in a way that, you know, I would never have been able to experience before. And all of a sudden, a whole lot of people realize that their relationship with gender is very different than what they had been, you know, raised to assume. But I hope that makes sense. Like, I know that, because like I know that's gonna kind of come off as me saying that I'm some sort of free speech warrior, but I'm not like, you know, I'm not like an Elon Musk guy. I just also know that technology, media, like the decisions we make about policies, about content, are going to affect a lot of conversations, and they're going to have impacts that we have to, at least if we are going to be making these decisions, we have to do them intentionally.
Yeah, which unfortunately I don't think people are equipped to do. They kind of just like, you know, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're making money, so why rock the boat, right? That's one of the problems I see with, you know, the situation as it is. And also, unfortunately, like, compounding that problem, the way I see it, is that there's a ton of people in power who should not be in power. Like, they're so old, they're so outdated, and that's not to say that, like, now we need, you know, like, the world to be run by 19-year-olds or anything, but it's very clear that people who grew up with this Cold War mentality and are now multimillionaires in Congress or in the halls of Parliament, and, you know, they're cottaging off it, you know, their family estates that they've had in the family for, you know, multiple generations at this point. It's like, that's not the world that most people live in anymore. The Soviet Union is gone. The Cold War is done. We have the internet now. We have, you know, new digital mediums and new ways of talking. The world is more connected than ever before, whether that was intentional or not. And yet the people in power are just kind of like, you know, I don't know. I guess you could just have a further consolidation of the telecom industry here in Canada. Sure, that seems fine, I guess. And I'm like, no, can we have some leadership? If you're going to keep forcing people to do everything online, it's like, go online. Then it should be a public utility at this point, you know? Like, and so these people in power right now are just like they're out of their depth, you know. Sure, they have depth in terms of other things like say foreign policy and stuff like that, but for the new society that is emerging, you know, we're not exactly being led by the best. It's a bunch of old and outdated people in this regard, who are happy to just kind of let the corporations keep doing what they're doing. And also, unfortunately, I find that there's a lot of people, including people I know, like hell, some of my relatives, who are just being pulled further and further right or further into conspiracy theories, whether it's about ancient aliens or it's about, you know, oh no, you know, like Trump's right about the deep state and stuff. And it's like, I need more time to explain this to you than at the family barbecue, you know. Like it's such a mountain to try and fight back against all of that just kind of keeps happening, right? And like, you know, like you said, there should be some kind of happy medium that's not Elon Musk being like, yeah, we should totally let the Nazis say tired old bullshit ideology. That there has to be somewhere between, you know, like, hey, you can maybe say one or two controversial things, but you can't, you know, target people, dox people, harass them, bully them into suicide and stuff like that. Like, there has to be a limit, because if you know, and a lot of people say, oh look, it's free speech, and it's like, yeah, but it's also in many cases behind the veil of anonymity. And society sometimes, you know, has elements of that, like, you know, when you're voting, it's not like you have your name on your ballot, but there's a lot in our society where it's not anonymous, and you have to work with people to have a functioning society. And if the digital world is just another avenue for human expression, that makes it a part of society, and it should be held to certain societal standards. What those are, well, that's the interesting conversation. But unfortunately, right now, it's just kind of this weird Wild West, and not like in the kind of fun way, like, you know, with like Angel Fire web pages for, you know, some girl's, you know, O-Town crush, or some dude's Lego collection, or some lady's, you know, little crochets that she sells and sends through the mail or something like that in the outskirts of Nebraska. Like, that was kind of fun. Like, you find forums like, oh, this is kind of neat. Now it's just kind of like, oh, well, the algorithm says you should listen more to, you know, some terrible person. And it's like, I'd really rather not. I want to know more, like, you know, what these activists are doing that's working and succeeding. I want to know about good news stories that have been happening. Tell me what's going on in the world with like some actual detail, especially on something that I don't know too much about. Show me, you know, beautiful photography, fascinating, beautiful landscapes. Tell me more about these people or this tribe or this nation that, yeah, I don't really think about or know that much about. Like, show me that rather than, you know, what's going to make the most money and what people think I'm going to be interested in based on the ones and zeros of an algorithm, which is basically a rock or even just a program that we tricked into thinking for us. Like, I hate it so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only thing that I could add to that is that I have concerns, because we were just talking about how there's also been this you know, blossoming of socialist movements brought about by Bernie Sanders's campaign, and like by sort of radicalization that's come out of the post 2008 material conditions of the world and stuff. And I'm curious if that the same technological and communication forces that are allowing left-wing discussions to happen like they are the same one that are also opening the floodgates to the radical right-wing fascism. The same sort of allowances, because if you think about the sort of media consumption that a lot of the people who are sort of running the world today had when they were young, were the, you know, the three big channels telling them everything that they could find out about a subject. They couldn't learn about the Soviet Union from the Soviets' perspective because they only heard NBC told them. So imagine, like, for example, Bernie Sanders trying to run for president when you only have MSNBC and CNN telling you what to think.
It's
And
a
you could
problem.
imagine, yes, which means that, like, I think there's a lot of, like, really good discussions about how do we keep people safe online, especially because um, harassment and radicalization is extremely, like, hate speech, like radicalization into, like, hate groups and motivating people to access stochastic terrorism, as well as horrible acts of harassment and bullying and vilification, are things that need to be addressed at a medium policy level that I think are important to talk about. Um, I just also think it's important that those decisions are never going to cut neutrally. And that if sort of the idea, like there's a lot of times where it's like, oh, like, we don't agree on basic facts anymore. Like, we need to go back to a time where we listened to experts, and, like, all this, there's sort of like a nostalgia for a media age in the past that's very prevalent, that I worry that, oh, you mean you want us to go back to a sort of technocratic liberal establishment telling us what to believe? I would love to see if I could have that cake and eat it too somehow. You know, the liberty that has come from these platforms letting people say anything without the dangers that come from letting people say anything.
Yeah, it's again, right? Like, there's definitely a conversation, and by conversation I mean a deep society spanning discussion to be had here. But again, I just don't think that the people in power and the current system as it is equipped to really handle that. The people who own the media or the means of production, they just kind of want to see whatever's going to produce the most money. Governments kind of just want a nice free and easy ride, especially if it's something they don't really understand, because, oh, what if we screw it up and then we're out of power? I don't want that. So it's kind of in this weird holding pattern almost of, yeah, we just kind of gotta live with this and accept this. And it's so clear from a lot of people on a bunch of different social media sites that they don't want that. They want something more. They want something equitable. And again, like, I'm not saying I have the answers here, but
Mm-hmm.
I think a time is hopefully coming soon where, you know, people will find something new, like a new social media platform, because, you know, these are all fairly new. Like, I remember graduating high school and Facebook was the hot new thing. Like, yeah, here's how we'll stay in touch. And now it's like this massive, you know, spy network basically that most people hate. Cool. This has been an interesting journey that I've seen and honestly didn't even really want to be a part of initially. TikTok is the hot new thing after Vine died, but Vine was popular for a while. Like, it's all it's a fertile ground for new things and innovation and for creativity, and people want that. But where this ends up in the future, I genuinely don't know. And like you said, I hope it ends up going to a better place, because where we are right now is not great in my opinion.
No. Yeah, because like there is an argument that you could link things like the rise in fascism in the 30s being linked to a similar moment where you had the sort of rise in radio as a public medium of communication, as at the same time as a big economic depression. And the sort of link of those two is sort of the rise of radical politics that happened around the world, but also in the radical left and radical right. And I am curious because, like, you know, one side of me is like, oh, like, the part of me that is a communications and technology historian is like, these mediums of communication allow us to facilitate all this stuff. But also the Marxist in me is like, yeah, radicalization is what comes out when people's lives suck.
Yeah,
If
that's
you want,
another
if
thing
you want,
about the 30s, right? Like, hey, why did fascism and communism rise? Because shit kind of sucked for a lot of people in the immediate aftermath of World War One and in the 30s. So
yeah. So I don't know. I feel like so you could say that maybe things will change. Maybe that I am completely wrong on that. So there's a third option that I am wrong about everything. which, frequently happens. Just look at the replies to episodes of the podcast. But
you should see my YouTube comments sometimes.
Yeah. And it could be that, in a very strictly Marxist analysis, that radicalization would happen regardless of what the media system says, just based on people's material experiences. Then of course, then the answer is that obviously you need to make a gigantic firewall and censor everything. Then the Chinese are the ones who figured it out, because they just focus on the material conditions, I guess, is their thing. I don't know. At this point, I'm like, I don't know what's going on in China, and I don't really trust anybody who can tell me what it's like, what their take is at this point.
Yeah, basically, it's like the only people who I trust are my handful of Chinese contacts, like a handful of other like Chinese podcasters or content creators online, because they're like Chinese American or like Anglo Chinese or Chinese Canadian. Like it's something like that, and they often go back, and so they point. It always starts the same way. It's like, differences between how I live my life in China versus here in Canada, America, Britain, etc. And then other times they're like, yes, like we should talk about the Great Firewall a bit, because like everyone in my family has a VPN and gets around it. I'm like, okay, makes sense, So I get like little snippets here and there, but do I trust everything that comes out of the PRC? No, just the same way I don't trust what all the Western media says about China. It's like the truth is somewhere in the middle, because both of you clearly want people to take away something, and it's probably something else that's not that.
Yeah, I think that to go super postmodern and also like to think like a historian on this, if you are curious about, if you're listening to this and watching this right now and you're like, I don't know what the hell to believe anymore, or what to what to take as fact anymore. The idea is that there is never such thing as something that is objective, that tells you exactly how it is, and that everything has some sort of goal, some sort of desire for what you want to take away from things. And so you have to just read things knowing what it is that they're going for, and corroborate and cross-reference and things like that.
I definitely see what you mean by that, because in a way that's something that has been talked about before, at least like with other people that I know, about how technically speaking we can only see 3 colors, and the brain just kind of makes the rest up as it goes along, and that's kind of a weird thought to try and wrap your mind around, right? But that's kind of one of the few objective realities we know. Our eyes can only see red, blue, and green light. Magenta doesn't exist. Pink doesn't really truly exist. It's like, it's kind of red, but eh. And that's why some people can't always agree on what a color is, even though we are technically looking at the same object, or the same flower, or the same, wallpaper, or whatever it might be. So yeah, sorry folks, but your reality is solely your own. Everyone else is operating on technically an individual level. So I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. And then when I also learned that brown is just dark orange, brain blown.
Yeah. That was just like, wait, what?
Yeah, that's a wild one. Brown doesn't exist. You can't get a brown light. It's not a thing. You can't. There's no light that makes brown light. Anyways, that's a complete tangent. I feel like that's the sign that I'm getting close to sleepy time.
You know what? That's fair. So on that note, after we've broken everyone's minds, good night, everybody. Hi, Bother Brigade. Thank you once again for tuning in to yet another episode of Progressive Profiles. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And also, if you want to see more special little excerpts from the interview that didn't make it into this cut, that's always available for our patrons over on Patreon, which again, that's going to be in the description down below, a link for that. And also, you will find the links to all of Tristan's channels down below. And again, thank you for coming on. This was a great time. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. Please let us know what your favorite part was. But again, I want to shout out the patrons without whom this show would not be possible. However, I do want to give a very special shout out to the following patrons for their incredible support of this channel: Jean-Luc Desroches, Jennifer Randall, Botherer69, Jay Peterson, and Patrick Mansouri. Thank you all so much, and thank you all to everyone who has been watching and tuning in. Hope you enjoyed, and hopefully see you next time. This was a lot of fun, but we talked about some pretty heavy stuff, including, where things might be headed with the media, which I guess you could say that's definitely what's bothering me today.